Hi, I'm Joanna Vicente, Executive Director and Co-Head of TIFF.
And I'm Cameron Bailey, Artistic Director and Co-Head of TIFF. As you join us today, we encourage you to reflect on the land that you're on, who the traditional keepers of the land are, what the treaty relationship is, or if it's unceded territory. We're located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. The territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We're grateful to work on this land.
Thank you so much for joining us for the 45th Toronto International Film Festival. We're not the only ones celebrating a special anniversary this year. A few festival favorites have also reached important milestones, and we're bringing them back to you in our series, The Best of TIFF Reunions, presented by Bell.
From a 4K drive-in screening of Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket to the first ever TIFF People's Choice Award winner, Girlfriends, from director Claudia Weil. To help us celebrate, we're reuniting key members of the cast and crew virtually, like Aronofsky himself, to discuss Requiem for a Dream, which, it's hard to believe, turns 20 this year. Audiences are invited to join the conversation and watch the films along with us on Bell Media's Crave.
These great films are an example of cinema's power to push limits, to draw tears, spark laughter, and to bring us together. But in order for them to do all of this, they must be seen. And right now, TIFF is struggling to bring the life-changing experiences of film to audiences. As a not-for-profit organization, TIFF has been affected by the global health pandemic.
A few months ago, we launched our For the Love of Film Fund to ensure that we continue to bring these vital stories to you each September and year-round. If you're able, please visit tiff.net/loveoffilm to make a donation of any size. And know that just by purchasing a ticket, you're supporting us and helping to share the power of film.
A sincere thank you to our lead sponsor Bell and our major sponsors RBC, L'Oréal Paris, and Visa for their steadfast commitment, as well as our major public supporters, the Government of Ontario, Telefilm Canada, and the City of Toronto for their continued support.
And thank you all for supporting TIFF. We hope you enjoy your festival.
How you doing? My name is Matthew Modine. Welcome to 2020, where we're forced to go into our closets to record messages for film festivals. I'm sorry I can't be with you at the Toronto International Film Festival. It's a wonderful festival, and it's an honor to be a part of the TIFF reunions presented by Bell. I want to thank everyone in the audience for supporting this festival. My father was a drive-in theater manager, and I grew up watching movies in drive-ins. So having the opportunity to sit outdoors under the stars and watch movies is something that I'm very familiar with, and I'm happy that the opportunity for you to experience a little piece of my childhood is happening for you. The presentation you're going to see tonight is a film by Stanley Kubrick, Full Metal Jacket, which is coming out as a 4K restoration. It was done by Leon Vitali, an assistant of Stanley Kubrick, a wonderful actor who appeared in Barry Lyndon. He supervised this transfer, and he's a great artist, and I wish that he were there with you tonight to be able to see this projected on the motion picture screen. I have nothing but great memories of having worked with Stanley Kubrick on this film. The best way for me to efficiently tell you about those experiences is through a book that I wrote called Full Metal Jacket Diary. If you have an iPad, I encourage you to download the app and enjoy it on your iPad. It's a detailed journey through the experience of having made the film, told from the point of view of a young 25-year-old actor. All right, that's all I got. And I hope that you enjoy the movie. And if you have any questions, ask me on Twitter at Matthew Modine. All right, peace.
Hi, My name's Leon Vitali, and I used to be an actor, and I worked for many years as Stanley Kubrick's assistant, especially on The Shining and Full Metal Jacket and Eyes Wide Shut. He asked me if I'd be interested in looking for little boys to play a role in The Shining, Danny role in The Shining. And from that, we sort of developed this relationship. And so I worked on Full Metal Jacket. Full Metal Jacket was a huge experience for me because really one learned how much you could do with so little to drive a very salient point across. It was a war movie, not an anti-war movie, not a pro-war movie. It was just a movie about war. And the subtlety of the difference, the nuance that exists between those three categories, you know, a war movie, anti-war movie, pro-war movie, they were very, very obvious to me. He stretched me as far as I could possibly have gone in the 30-odd years from when I knew him to when he died. He taught me so much, of course, and I still miss him to this day. I know we've got several members of the Full Metal Jacket cast who are going to say their things to you, and I know that for them, for all of them, it was a seminal experience. So I worked as a dialogue coach with all the actors, and I think you'd see that just about every bit of casting was perfect. You had Matthew Modine, you had Arliss Howard, you had Vincent D'Onofrio, and you had the whole platoon, and then you had Lee Ermey. Lee Ermey was a revelation for, I think, for everybody, including Stanley. And with that kind of mixture and with that kind of story that we had, which is really very focused, I think you've got a movie which approached the subject of war and what it does to people and how it affects people from a completely different angle, and leaves you with something which you just feel you got to think about, and you can come back to it another time and it'll look different for every time you screen it or you view it. It was a great experience. It really was. And I met some wonderful people, you know, the cast, the crew. It's one of those things you carry around with you for the rest of your life. And as a film, I think it stands up as just one of the very best war movies ever made. I'm very happy that it's being honored in this way by the Toronto Film Festival. So thank you, enjoy the experience, and and watch it again. Thank you.
Welcome to the Best of TIFF Reunions presented by Bell, reuniting creators and collaborators from now classic films that have screened at past editions of the festival and at the TIFF Bell Lightbox year-round. My name is Richard Krause, and it's my great pleasure to be your moderator today. On the eve of a new 4K restoration of Stanley Kubrick's classic 1987 film Full Metal Jacket, we are thrilled to celebrate the legacy of this film with a very special group. With us today, we have stars Vincent D'Onofrio and Arliss Howard, and Stanley Kubrick's daughter, Katharina Kubrick. We should also give a sincere thank you to our lead sponsor, Bell, for their continued support, and a huge thank you as well to the team at Warner Brothers for their collaboration, allowing us to bring this amazing group together, and for providing us with the brand new 4K restoration of the film that we are absolutely privileged to share with audiences for the first time at the 45th Toronto International Film Festival on September 18th. Finally, a big thank you to our audiences for joining us. As an organization still impacted by COVID-19, TIFF needs the support of audiences so that we can continue to present films to future generations. Welcome, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Nice to be here.
Hello.
I put this question out for everyone. There are a lot of movies about Vietnam. What makes Full Metal Jacket so singular?
Well, I think, first of all, it was directed by Stanley Kubrick. That's a pretty singular thing right there. You know, his whole approach to filmmaking and storytelling, it's quite unique. You know, he's one of those guys that have been around for my generation that makes very particular films. Only they don't remind you of anybody else's films. You know, you see a film and you know if Stanley Kubrick directed it. I say that's a good place to start when it comes to what singles Full Metal Jacket out when it comes to Vietnam films, war films.
And from what I've been reading about this, and you were all there, so you tell me, but it seems from my research that the film was always, it felt like it was on the verge of derailing somehow. What was it like to be there on the set? Did you fully comprehend what was happening while the film was being made? Because the shoot was much longer than a normal shoot.
I'll just speak to my own perception. I wasn't aware that the film was ever in any danger of not being completed or that there was any difficulty. I just don't even know of anything like that. It was long in a large part because of Lee's accident, but there's also and some of this is so, you know, with memory, everything that you remember is triggered by the thing that causes you to remember it. So over the years, my memory, you know, I don't trust exactly my memory, I would say, because it's with my perception. But I will say that it's very difficult to shoot a movie like this, you know, and to do it in the way that he wanted to shoot it. And I should speak also to what Vince alluded to at the beginning, which is really all you need to say about it. It's a Stanley Kubrick movie and all that implies. But Stanley wasn't really making a Vietnam movie, in my view. Vietnam is where the movie was set. Stanley made movies about the mechanisms that human beings create to destroy themselves.
Yeah.
Whether it's class systems or, like in Barry Lyndon, whether it's nuclear arsenals and Strangelove, and he was fascinated with this. And so Vietnam was largely only there because he loved Gus's book. And Gus's book, if you read the book, it's extraordinary, the take on it. You know, that a mind like that could have survived the carnage that Gus did. And at any rate, my experience was that it was very painstaking. We were young, we were impatient. He was not. And so it seemed much longer to us than it did to him because he was going home to his family. And, you know, to give you an example of that, when I saw Katharina with her dog, I was reminded that for 4 or 5 months during the thing, he was getting ready to bury a dog that was about to pass away. And he had the carpenter bring him different caskets to look at. And he would look at them and say, no, I think that's a little too whatever. He didn't like the fitting. He didn't like the wood. And I found that just extraordinary that he could pay attention to things like that as well as what he was having to do during the day. And this was my experience of him, you know, this relentless horizontal curiosity and the ability to absorb a lot of information and stay completely focused. It was quite extraordinary.
I think that it was exhausting trying to keep up with himself because he was interested and on top of almost everything. So whether it was shooting his film or worrying about how we were going to bury one of our dogs, it was hard to keep up with himself. But, you know, going back to your original question about why he made this film, I think he was more interested in how human beings ultimately are self-destructive and how we're our own worst enemies. And it was just, he found the perfect story to illustrate that. He found the perfect cast to illustrate that. And he always said, he wanted to get the detail right, and it had to be accurate, but it also had to be interesting. And I think the way you see how human beings are made to be self-destructive and how they're prepared ultimately for war by the very fact of their self-destruction is what that film's about. And all his anti-war films, Paths of Glory being the first one, and ultimately Dr. Strangelove, which, God hope he wasn't making a documentary. He was a great observer of humanity, and not dispassionate and not cold, because he was incredibly warm, and he was so emotional. He took everything on board, and he took it into his very soul. And he said, but look at what we're doing to ourselves. And that's what I get from his films. And I don't know about, Arliss and Vincent and your experiences working with him, but the depths to which he went to try and figure something out, the best way to do it, and to wring every ounce of emotion from a scene. You probably experienced that in spades.
Katharina mentioned preparing these young men to go to war, and I find it really interesting, and I don't know that I noticed it the first time through, but we hear everyone's real name once, and then everyone's given a nickname after that, and that's the only thing that they are identified by. It's a way of stripping away part of their identity, I suppose, in the way that they are being reshaped to be warriors. Was that something that either of you as actors discussed with Stanley Kubrick?
It was discussed on set. I mean, there was definitely the idea of making killing machines out of these young men. There was definitely that idea, and stripping the idea of what you said about stripping everything down and then giving them some kind of another title, rather than not just another title, but to recreate them as a person, not the person they were born with or originally named as. Yeah, it's you're on target when it comes to that. There was discussion. I have to say though that one of the ways that Stanley was the first film director, that I ever worked with.
Mm-hmm.
So it was an extraordinary thing for a young man my age at the time to experience. I mean, I was lucky to have Arliss and Matthew there, because they were both working already. But his approach to filmmaking was something that has always stayed with me, because he talked very little about character and very little about story to me, and that was my experience. What he did do was he in his own kind of personal way, he made sure that I understood why I was there. Like he made sure that I understood what my job was, rather than how to do my job or what my job should be. He wanted to make sure that I knew that I had this job, I had to accomplish a thing, and that he was depending on me to do that. And to the point where he would invite us on the set and just simply say, "What are you going to do?" And that is so inspiring for him to cast us or me. I mean, it was clear to me by looking at Arliss and Matthew. I'll never forget this, that my first day on set working with those two guys, Arliss and Matthew, when I would look at them, it completely made sense to me why they were there, why Stanley had them there, and why they were doing what they were doing. in the confident way they were doing it. And so that made me feel like, oh, geez, I must be here for the same reason. That's pretty cool. And I can rise to that, like I can rise to where they are. I can get there, and this was fascinating for a young actor like myself.
Vincent, do you feel that you were, I know Keir Delay said this, and he knew that he was well cast. So I'm assuming you figured that Stanley cast you because he knew that you had what he wanted.
Right, so, exactly, Katharina. I saw it, right, and I realized that by watching Arliss and Matthew and Stanley interact. I said, oh, I get it. Yeah, these guys are here because he wants them to do this job. And I thought, okay, he wants me to do, my job. And that's why I'm here. That's why he cast me. Yeah, it was fascinating.
There's a scene in one of the documentaries where Matthew's talking to Stanley and he says, I don't know what you to do. And he's saying, I don't want you to do anything. Just be who you are.
Yeah.
The fact is that your face fit, who you are fit, and he loved the way you worked on screen, all of you. So he chose you for a reason, and he knew what he was doing. Dare I say?
Well, he totally did. When I know he did when it came to the three of us. Yeah, when Arliss and Matthew, he definitely knew what he was doing there. The rapport that Matthew and Arliss had to watch that live on set was. When they were acting was a pretty cool thing for me. It's and what Katharina said about him being a sensitive human being. I'll never forget the scene where, what do they call it? They call it the blanket party.
Mm-hmm.
Where Arliss and Matthew beat me with the soap bars, and the other guys do, and then they kind of, Arliss, you held me down, right, or something like that, or yeah. But the thing I remember most about it is that the emotional aspect of it. He, without ever there being any kind of discussion between Stanley and I, he allowed me to do it the way I do it. Like I had my Walkman playing No Woman, No Cry in my ears in between takes. I had the sensitivity that takes for us to be able to do that scene so quickly in 8 or 9 takes or whatever it was. And for him to understand the emotional aspect of it and the way it was performed by the three of us, and there wasn't any questions. There was no complications. Everything was laid out from the three of us in a very simple way. Stanley knew what he wanted. He knew where we wanted us to be, where the light we had to be conscious of being in the light, hitting our marks, and the rest was just, he let us take the scene in this emotional place. You can't do that without being an incredibly sensitive human being. To know when that's working and when that's not is a huge thing. It's a huge thing.
Arliss, before we started recording, you had said that over the course of the year that you were on set, that you changed, and you talked about Vincent and Matthew as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to be there that long, and what changed over that amount of time?
Well, it's like anything in a calendar year. I mean, as you get older, the calendar years are sort of subservient to the aggregate of your life. You can't really single, but when you're, late 20s, early 30s, like we were, a year is a lot of bandwidth, and so and of course, again, at the time you're doing it, you're just living your life. You're going to work, you're coming home, you're having a good day, you're having a bad day. People are coming in to London where we were, people are leaving. But as I said, Matthew's oldest son was born. I lost a child. There were marriages, divorces. I mean, there was a lot of things going on. And it was for me, I want to say, pursuant to that, everything after that was different in terms of my work, because he essentially taught me how to work. And I had worked with some great actors before and some pretty good directors, but I had never worked with somebody who looked at it so purely as a job. And I don't mean like you punch in and punch out, but the same way that I would do work here on my farm or anything else. You start out with a plan, you have an idea of what you want to do, and then everything happens. So this notion of Stanley as a control freak is kind of interesting to me, because my experience was he would say things like, well, there's one place to put the camera and we're going to find it. And we would come in, and the scene where Matthew and I reunite in Vietnam, he had the camera on the opposite side of that pavilion that Anton had built. And we were 2 hours into it, and we broke for tea. When we came back, he said, well, we've got to change. That's not where I want the camera. And right away, this is early on in the shoot for me, I realized, oh, he's not, you talk about a boss, this is what a boss does on a job. Mm-hmm. A boss goes, this is what I want to do. And like Vince said, I got you here because I know you can do this, and I want you to do this. And we're going to start here. And if it's not a good place to be, we're going to move over here. And it's all very simple, but it was revolutionary to me. I'd never seen anybody tear out a master like that. He tore the whole master out, relit it, and all the work that we had done was, not a reference point. We were now in a different camera angle, different attitude. And so I started looking at my life that way, funnily enough, well, just tear out the front end of it and let's just start over.
Do you think, sorry to interrupt, do you think that working with him, that you got the feeling that he was very free form, very experimental, and he didn't always know what he wanted, and he was willing to try any variation until he said, there's the magic. That's what I want to see. Now you guys are cooking. Let's do it again and see what you can drag out of your souls for it. Because there was a script, but the script would change and dialogue would change, because making a film is a collaborative effort. You can't do this on your own. And he cast well, and he allowed, I believe, certainly I know that speaking to Keir DeLay, that this was his experience, that he said, look, there's no such thing as a bad idea. Tell me what you're thinking, and let me know how you want to play this. Okay, let's try it.
Well, I think with small as well.
He was a true artist working with other artists, and I think when it was right, it was right. But I think that he had to milk it for every single ounce that he could. That's my impression, anyway.
Well, did you get the sense that working with a smaller crew, I'm told 15 to 20 people, made him more nimble and more willing to take chances because there weren't as many people on set?
Well, we started out with, this is how it always goes, we started out with a really big crew, and we ended up with a small crew. I mean, there would be things like, you just realized, and it was never a big deal or anything, but if somebody, for whatever reason, he wouldn't even know it, he wouldn't be there the next day. And it would be that there had been a part of the job that Stanley didn't feel like had been done correctly and didn't bode well for the future. And so that person would no longer, be there. It wasn't a big deal. It was just, and this is another interesting thing. He was always dealing with things like tea times and unions and all the machinations around filmmaking, the business of filmmaking. And at one point, a plane flew over where we were in Basingbourn, or Beckton Gas Works. Plane flew over. And he looks up and he said, "Oh yeah, that's Warner Brothers. They're checking on me." And this little impish grin, just sort of snuck up around. He loved the idea of that. And so he was always managing these things. Like, I got there at 5 a.m. once, and I was, at that point, I was really, really tired. So at 5 a.m, my call, I would fall asleep in the back of the car that was carrying me there. And I woke up and I thought, I wasn't sure I was dreaming or I had died, because it was this mist coming off the Thames and these big Spanish palm trees coming by on skids being moved to the location. And I could only see the tops of the trees through the window moving. And I thought, that's it. I died in London. And, and so there was an element of surreality to it that was also grounded in this incredibly, I think what he did, to Katharina's point about experimental improvisation, he came in with such a cage that was built. I mean, Anton's designs were fantastic. And so that would sort of tell you where the camera might start, for example. And the light was coming a certain way that he wanted. He would manage all these things, but inside of that cage that he built, he turned loose and he said, okay, let's see what's going to happen. And then he would let it lead him to where he ended up, because he's the most curious guy I've ever met, the most curious adult male I have ever met.
Yeah, same here. Same here, yeah.
Totally. Anybody more curious?
Yeah, totally.
Is it true that you hung up on him when he first called to offer you the part?
Who, me? Yeah.
Well,
you talking to me?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Well, because this is why, though, is at the time I was like a bodyguard bouncer kind of guy in New York, and I was making cast, but I was working with all these cops and firefighters, and they knew I was an actor because I would invite them to these little off things that I was doing and stuff, and they would, they loved making fun of me and giving me a hard time about what I was doing. And so I knew, of course, I'd seen all Stanley's movies because my father was into films, but I didn't put two and two together that he didn't have a British accent. Like I hadn't studied filmmakers. Like, I didn't know that Stanley, where he was born, where he was from. And so when I first heard his voice, I was like, this is not Stanley Kubrick. It can't be Stanley Kubrick. It's one of my friends giving me a hard time because they knew that I was waiting for the call, And so that's how that happened. It's not, to talk to Leon on the phone I think he was the first person that I talked to before I talked to Stanley. And I was like, I was so confused that they were actually talking to me, like it was confusing, especially the way Leon talks. He takes a long time to say things, and he does it in this very kind of Leon way, and it's fanciful and intelligent, but it takes a while for him to articulate the exact reason why he's talking to you. And especially for me at that age, like, I wasn't used to that kind of flourishing in people's speak, And it took me a long time to understand that I got the job. Like, I didn't get it. Like, he might have even told me that I got the job, and I still didn't know that I got the job. You got to imagine I was 24, maybe 24 years old. And
you didn't have an agent even then?
No, I didn't have an agent. I didn't have anything. Like, I went to the office of William Morris, and I walked up to the secretary on the first floor at the receptionist, and I said, "Who's your best agent?" And she said, "Who are you? Why do you want to know that?" I said, "Well, I need to talk to the best agent that you have." can you put them on the phone for me? And she said, why? I said, well, because I'm doing this part in this Stanley Kubrick movie, and I'd like to talk to somebody because I need an agent. And I had only heard the name William Morris. I thought that was the only agency in New York. I didn't know anything. And I got Johnny Planko's secretary at the time, and I said, yeah, can I just talk to him? I've landed this part in the Stanley Kubrick movie. And I heard them talking in the background, and I heard Johnny ask, well, how big is the part that he got? And I said, well, I think it's like, a major role that starts off the film. This is what I'm hearing. This is what Stanley Kubrick is telling me. and there was this long silence, and Johnny got on the phone and just said 2 words, said, come up. And I went up to his office and I got an agent. It was all very,
That's usually the other way around, though, isn't it?
Yeah. It was all very strange and daunting for a young man who was just studying and doing theater and, on very little sleep, because I used to, work all night and then do a play during the day or go study at where I was studying. It was crazy time. But yes, so many crazy things happened. Yeah.
Katharina, you looked for locations for Untitled Jacket. Tell me a little bit about if it was daunting, if it wasn't, I don't know. But finding Vietnam in England, in the East London somewhere. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, actually, he was always very positive and very optimistic, thinking that, he would be able to just send a unit over to France or Spain or Portugal. So I spent a lot of time at the Portuguese and Spanish embassies in London looking at photographs, and he was going to shoot scenes in rice paddies, he thought. So I was dispatched to initially France, then to Portugal, and then Spain, looking for rice fields and bamboo forests and all sorts of things. And, it was really interesting trip, but I think that the best story was that he sent me to this place in Spain called Las Marismas, because we had looked at photographs of these extraordinary tropical looking landscape, and with blue and rice and stuff. So he thought that would be a great place to shoot certain scenes. So first, I get to Marismas and the door's shut, and they say, well, you can't come in. I said, what do you mean I can't come in? And they said, well, because you have to be a scientist or a biologist and you have to book 2 years in advance to get in here. So now I'm on the phone to Warner Brothers in Madrid going, they won't let me in. Stanley's on the phone going, what do you mean you can't get in? And let me talk to somebody. So he makes a couple of phone calls. Next thing I know, I go back there. I'm in a Land Rover with a man with a big droopy moustache, a beer gut, and wandering hands, sitting in the front. I'm sitting in the front seat with a bunch of other photographers behind me and scientists. And there's this guy. It's this straight out of a spaghetti western, and he's putting his hands on my knee, and I'm thinking, oh, Jesus. So we get to Las Marismas through the gates, and it's a desert because it's summer and it's dry. So this is a special area. It's protected, and it was dry, and there were cow skulls on the ground. There was no water. There was no marshland. There was no nothing. So I'm on the phone again in the evening. I said, Dad, look, all those photographs we saw and all those books at the Spanish Museum. This place it's a park. It's a special scientific place of study. And I said, there's no way they're going to let you shoot a war film here and blow shit up. They're just not going to let you do it. So he was ranting and raving and blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, I did go to lots of different places looking for that. So, but we all know that he didn't really like traveling. He liked to sleep in his own bed at night. And I think that initially he had thought that those teams would have been second unit. Like on The Shining, I was sent to Alaska to set up second unit location for when Halloran gets the plane back to the Overlook. And so I got to Alaska in January, and I was there for 4 or 5 weeks, and it didn't snow, so they sent me back. So it was a series of circumstances that led to him shooting in England. Also, as you know, Arliss and Vincent, that Beckton Gas Works had been semi-derelict or derelict for quite some time, and Anton found it, and they're going to blow it up, and absolutely perfect. And there's a story that when Stanley said, can we blow stuff up, and the CEOs, their wives and families came to watch it all, being blown up. And it was a filthy, horrible location, there's no doubt. But the reason it was perfect, he said that you can't invent rubble, you can't make stone, you can't design sort of destruction, because it always looks designed. Iron rock or plaster rock looks like exactly what it is. So for the purposes of this particular film, it was absolutely made, location made in heaven, because you could never build that. And he loved all the explosions. He loved all that stuff. And, and the things, it looks great, doesn't it? It's like, and he would come home and he was absolutely filthy and very tan. He had a sort of swan vesta tan. So he was brown to here, and the rest of him wasn't. And he loved it, though. And I think he was incredibly proud of that movie. And I think he made a really great film.
We have to leave it there. Thank you so much. I have dozens more questions I could ask, but that's all our time. Thank you so much for joining us today. Vincent D'Onofrio, Arliss Howard, Katharina Kubrick. A good and huge congratulations to all of you and the team at Warner Brothers on the new 4K restoration of the film, which will be out on Blu-ray on September 22nd. Finally, those of you tuning in from Canada at home can watch the film on Bell Media's Crave. My name is Richard Krause. Thank you all for chatting with me, and thank you for watching.